The first gunshot of the day sent Eleanor Zuckerman scurrying beneath her father's mercantile counter. Her trembling hands pressed against her ears as chaos erupted in the dusty streets of Promise Creek. It was 1875, and at 20 years old, Eleanor had yet to utter more than a handful of words to anyone outside her family. Not because she couldn't speak, but because something within her seized up whenever eyes turned her way, leaving her throat dry as the Arizona desert that surrounded their frontier town. "Eleanor Jane, get up and help me with these supplies before they're all shot to pieces." Her father bellowed over the commotion outside. Another shootout between the sheriff and some rowdy cattle rustlers had sent the town into a frenzy. Eleanor nodded quickly, rising to her feet with practiced obedience. Her fingers worked deftly, sorting inventory while her mind drifted elsewhere beyond the wooden walls of the store, beyond the boundaries of this small settlement that had grown increasingly suffocating with each passing year. "Lord Almighty, that girl," Mrs. Peterson whispered to Eleanor's father when she thought Eleanor couldn't hear. "Pretty as a picture but lazy as a summer day, never speaks up, never helps with the socials. How do you expect to marry her off, Jacob?" Her father merely sighed, a sound Eleanor had grown accustomed to disappointment wrapped in resignation. "She's just shy, Martha. She'll find her voice someday," but Eleanor knew better. She wasn't shy, she was drowning in words unsaid, in thoughts too complex to untangle and present to a world that had already decided she was simple-minded or indolent. Lazy, they called her. Slow, touched in the head. All because she couldn't force sound past the knot in her throat when too many eyes turned her way. The commotion outside gradually settled, and the regular rhythm of the day resumed. Eleanor continued arranging jars of preserved peaches, her movements careful and precise. Through the storefront window, she watched as the townspeople returned to their business, women clutching their shawls tightly around their shoulders, men straightening their hats as if nothing had happened. Then a stranger rode into town. He sat tall on a chestnut mare, his form silhouetted against the setting sun. Unlike the other cowboys who passed through Promise Creek with their loud voices and roughhousing, this one moved with quiet purpose. His dark hat was pulled low, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see that trail dust had settled into every crease of his clothing. "Look lively, Eleanor," her father said, nudging her with his elbow. "New customer." The bell above the door jingled as the stranger entered the mercantile. Eleanor kept her eyes down, suddenly fascinated by the grain of the wooden counter. She sensed rather than saw him approach, his spurs making a gentle rhythm against the floorboards. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice low and smooth like honey poured over gravel. "Need some supplies." "Welcome to Zuckerman's," her father replied heartily. "Jacob Zuckerman at your service. Whatever you need, we've got it or can get it." Eleanor dared a glance upward and found herself looking into the most piercing blue eyes she'd ever seen. They crinkled slightly at the corners, as if the man smiled more often than frowned, though his expression now remained neutral. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. "Ethan Robbins," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Just passing through on my way to California." His gaze shifted to Eleanor, and unlike most people who quickly looked away when she failed to speak, he held her eyes steadily. "Madam," Eleanor nodded, her customary response. Her father stepped forward to fill the silence. "This is my daughter, Eleanor. She'll help you gather whatever you need while I tend to the ledgers." Panic fluttered in Eleanor's chest. Her father often did this, forced her into interactions, hoping one day she'd miraculously overcome whatever held her voice captive. She shot him a pleading look, but he was already retreating to his desk in the back, deliberately ignoring her distress. "I need coffee, flour, salt, ammunition for a Winchester rifle, and something sweet if you've got it," Ethan listed, seemingly unbothered by her silence. Eleanor moved from behind the counter, gesturing for him to follow. She led him through the store, gathering his requested items and placing them in a burlap sack. When they reached the candy jars, she paused, looking at him questioningly. "Surprise me," he said with a half smile. Eleanor selected a handful of peppermint sticks, remembering how the cowboys who passed through often craved something fresh and sweet after weeks of trail dust. She added them to his supplies. Perfect choice, Ethan said. Clears the mind on a long journey. As they returned to the counter, Mrs. Peterson and her daughter Beatrice entered the store. Eleanor tensed immediately. Jacob Zuckerman, have you heard about the dance Saturday next? Mrs. Peterson called out, her voice carrying through the store like a trumpet. The whole town's coming together to welcome the new schoolteacher. Sounds wonderful, Martha, her father replied, emerging from the back room. Beatrice, a pretty blonde with a sharp tongue, eyed Ethan appreciatively before turning to Eleanor. Will you be attending, Eleanor? Or will you just stand in the corner like a piece of furniture again? She laughed lightly, as if she'd made a harmless jest. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck as she focused intently on tallying Ethan's purchases. The numbers swam before her eyes. Perhaps the lady prefers observation to idle chatter, Ethan said suddenly, his voice calm but carrying an edge. I find there's wisdom in that. Beatrice looked startled, clearly unused to having her barbs deflected. Well, I suppose someone has to hold up the wall, she recovered with a titter. Ethan placed his payment on the counter, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Her silence speaks to me more than most folks' endless prattling. He gathered his supplies and tipped his hat. Thank you for your help, Miss Zuckerman. Your assistance was more valuable than words could express. The bell jingled as he left, leaving Eleanor standing motionless behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. Well, I never, Mrs. Peterson huffed, clearly affronted on her daughter's behalf, but Eleanor barely heard her. For the first time in her memory, someone had defended her silence rather than condemning it. Someone had looked at her and seen not what she lacked, but what she offered. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her narrow bed, replaying the encounter with Ethan Robbins. Just passing through, he'd said, on his way to California. By this time tomorrow, he'd be gone, and her life would continue as it always had, a series of silent days punctuated by disappointment and misunderstanding. The thought sat like a stone in her chest. Before dawn, Eleanor slipped from bed and dressed quickly. She moved silently through the house she shared with her father above the mercantile, careful not to wake him. Outside, Promise Creek was still sleeping, the main street empty save for a mangy dog picking through discarded scraps. She headed for the livery stables, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. Perhaps she just wanted to see the chestnut mare, to confirm that yesterday's encounter had been real and not something she'd conjured from desperate loneliness. The stable was quiet and dim, smelling of hay and horse. Eleanor moved carefully between the stalls, peering at each occupant. Near the back, she found the chestnut mare, its coat gleaming even in the low light. She's a beauty, isn't she? Eleanor whirled around to find Ethan sitting on a bale of hay, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He looked as if he'd been awake for hours or perhaps hadn't slept at all. Didn't mean to startle you, he said, rising to his feet. Maple here is particular about who handles her in the mornings. Eleanor nodded, approaching the mare carefully. The horse snuffled at her palm, then permitted her to stroke its velvety nose. She likes you, Ethan observed. She's got good judgment. Eleanor glanced at him, then quickly away. In the early morning light filtering through the stable windows, he looked less trail-worn than he had the previous day. His jaw was clean-shaven now, revealing a small scar near his chin. I was going to head out at first light, he continued, moving to stand beside her at the stall door. But something tells me I might linger in Promise Creek a while longer. Eleanor raised an eyebrow in question. There's a certain quality to the silence here, he said, his voice softer now. Reminds me of home. Eleanor reached into her pocket and withdrew a small notebook and pencil she always carried. After a moment's hesitation, she wrote quickly and turned the page toward him. Where is home? Ethan read aloud. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. That's the question, isn't it? I was raised in Pennsylvania, but I haven't called anywhere home since the war ended. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Many men had returned from the Civil War changed, rootless. Some passed through Promise Creek looking haunted, others desperate, but all searching for something. You've lived here your whole life? Ethan asked. Eleanor shook her head and wrote again. St. Louis until I was 12, he read. What brought your family west? Eleanor hesitated, then wrote simply, Mother died, father needed a fresh start. Ethan's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. He didn't offer platitudes or change the subject as most people did when death was mentioned. Instead, he stood quietly beside her, both of them stroking Maple's nose as the mare contentedly accepted their attention. I should be on my way, he said finally. California won't come to me. Eleanor felt disappointment settle over her like a heavy blanket. She nodded, stepping back from the stall. Unless, Ethan continued, studying her face, you might show me around Promise Creek today. I find I'm curious about this place. Hope fluttered in Eleanor's chest. She nodded again, more eagerly this time. I'll meet you at the Mercantile in an hour, he said, smiling. After you've had breakfast and I've tended to Maple here. Eleanor hurried back home, slipping inside just as her father was coming down the stairs. Up early, he questioned, surprise evident in his voice. And where have you been? Eleanor gestured vaguely toward the street, unwilling to reveal her encounter at the stables. Well, get yourself presentable. We open in 30 minutes, he said, moving past her toward the kitchen. Eleanor rushed through her morning routine, pinning her dark hair into a neat bun and changing into her second-best dress, a soft blue calico that brought out the gray in her eyes. When she descended to the store, her father looked at her curiously but said nothing about her unusually careful appearance. The bell above the door rang precisely an hour after Eleanor had left Ethan at the stables. He entered the store looking refreshed, his dark hair still damp from washing. Mr. Zuckerman, he greeted Eleanor's father. I was hoping to borrow your daughter for a few hours. I'm new to town and could use a guide. Jacob Zuckerman's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Eleanor, he asked, as if to confirm they were speaking about the same person. Yes, sir. She kindly agreed this morning when we crossed paths. Her father looked between them, clearly bewildered by this development. Well, I suppose, if Eleanor's willing. He glanced at his daughter questioningly. Eleanor nodded firmly, already untying her apron. Have her back by supper, her father said, still looking confused. And mind you treat her with respect, Mr. Robbins. Wouldn't dream of anything else, sir, Ethan replied seriously. Outside, the morning sun bathed Promise Creek in golden light. Eleanor stood uncertainly on the boardwalk, suddenly aware that she had no idea how to guide someone through a town where she herself was barely more than a shadow. Where to first? Ethan asked, seemingly content to follow her lead. Eleanor considered, then pointed down the street toward the small church that doubled as the schoolhouse during the week. Perfect, Ethan said. I always like to know where folks go to save their souls. As they walked, Eleanor became acutely aware of the stairs following them. Promise Creek wasn't large, and the sight of silent Eleanor Zuckerman strolling with a handsome stranger was certainly novel enough to turn heads. People are curious creatures, Ethan remarked, noticing her discomfort. Always fascinated by what doesn't concern them. Eleanor's lips curved in a small smile. They continued their tour, Eleanor leading him to the schoolhouse, the sheriff's office, the small doctor's practice, and finally to the creek that gave the town its name, a modest waterway that nevertheless provided life to the settlement. Promise Creek, Ethan mused as they stood on its banks. Named with hope, I imagine, Eleanor nodded, then opened her notebook to write. Town founder said the land promised prosperity if we respected it. Wise words, Ethan replied after reading. Has it kept its promise? Eleanor shrugged, then wrote again. For some, not all dreams grow here. Ethan studied her face for a long moment. And your dreams, Eleanor, do they grow here? She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. After a moment, she wrote simply, they sleep. Perhaps they're just waiting for the right season, he suggested gently. They sat by the creek for a while, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Eleanor felt a curious lightness in her chest, as if some tight-bound part of her was slowly unfurling. I was a different person before the war, Ethan said suddenly, his eyes on the flowing water. Talked all the time. My mother used to say I was born speaking and hadn't paused for breath since. He smiled ruefully. Then I saw things, did things, and words started to feel hollow. Eleanor watched his profile, the way the sunlight caught in his eyelashes. For 2 years after I came home, I barely spoke at all, he continued. My family thought I'd lost my mind along with my innocence. They couldn't understand that silence was the only thing that made sense anymore. Eleanor touched his arm lightly, drawing his attention. She wrote carefully, "How did you find your voice again?" Ethan read her question and considered it thoughtfully. "I realized that silence and speech both have power depending on how you use them. Some days I still prefer silence, but I've learned when words matter." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding blooming within her. "Your silence isn't emptiness, Eleanor," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I can see that. It's full of thought and feeling, just expressed differently than most people expect." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. In all her 20 years, no one had ever described her silence as anything but a flaw to be corrected or pitied. "Why are you crying?" Ethan asked softly. Eleanor wiped her eyes and wrote shakily, "No one has ever understood before." "Then they weren't looking properly," he replied simply. They walked back toward town as the afternoon waned, both reluctant for their time together to end. As they approached the Mercantile, Eleanor saw Beatrice Peterson and several other young women gathered outside the millinery shop. Their chatter ceased abruptly as they spotted Eleanor and Ethan. "Well, if it isn't our mute merchandise girl," Beatrice called out, her voice saccharine. "Found yourself a handsome guide, Mr. Robbins. She won't talk your ear off, that's certain." Eleanor felt her face flush with humiliation, but before she could react, Ethan's hand found the small of her back, steadying her. "Miss Peterson, isn't it?" he replied coolly. "I was just remarking to Miss Zuckerman how refreshing it is to spend time with someone who thinks before she speaks. A rare quality, I've found." Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a fish, while her companions tittered nervously behind their hands. "If you'll excuse us, ladies," Ethan continued, guiding Eleanor past them, "we have more pleasant company to keep." As they reached the Mercantile door, Eleanor touched Ethan's arm to stop him. She quickly wrote in her notebook, "Thank you." Ethan read it and shook his head. "No need to thank me for speaking the truth, Eleanor." Inside, Jacob Zuckerman looked up from serving a customer, surprise evident on his face when he saw his daughter's flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "Right on time for supper," he noted. "Mr. Robbins, would you care to join us?" "I was just closing up shop." "I'd be honored, sir," Ethan replied, removing his hat. That evening, Eleanor sat at her family's small table feeling as if she were in a dream. Ethan conversed easily with her father, discussing everything from cattle prices to politics, but his eyes frequently sought hers across the table, including her in the conversation without requiring her to speak. "So what brings you to these parts, Mr. Robbins?" her father asked as they finished their meal. "You mentioned California yesterday." "I did," Ethan agreed. "I've been wandering since the war, taking odd jobs. Heard there might be opportunities out west for a man willing to work." "What line of work are you in?" "I was a teacher before the war," Ethan replied, surprising Eleanor. "Taught mathematics and natural philosophy at a boys' school in Philadelphia. Since then, I've tried my hand at ranching, mining, and most recently, working as a surveyor for the railroad." "A teacher," Jacob exclaimed. "Well, that's providential. Our school teacher just eloped with a traveling salesman last month. Town's been in an uproar trying to find a replacement before the new term." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Indeed. The town council would snap you up in a heartbeat if you're interested. Pay isn't much, but it's steady work." "I hadn't considered stopping here," Ethan said thoughtfully, his eyes finding Eleanor's, "but I'm finding Promise Creek has unexpected charms." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "Think on it," her father urged. "I'm on the council. I could put in a word." "I appreciate that, Mr. Zuckerman. I will certainly consider it." Later, as Eleanor cleared the dishes, her father pulled her aside. "That young man seems taken with you," he said quietly, "and you with him unless I miss my guess." Eleanor ducked her head, unable to deny it. "He's educated, polite, seems steady." Her father's voice grew gentle. "And he doesn't seem bothered by your quietness." Eleanor glanced toward the parlor where Ethan waited, feeling a flutter of possibility she'd never allowed herself to entertain before. "Just be careful with your heart, Eleanor," her father advised. "He's still a drifter until he proves otherwise." Eleanor nodded, squeezing her father's hand in silent appreciation for his concern. In the parlor, Ethan stood examining the few books on their modest shelf. He turned as Eleanor entered, his face lighting up in a way that made her heart skip. Your father's gone to bed, she wrote in her notebook. Early riser. A good quality in a merchant, Ethan replied. He hesitated, then added, I should go as well. I've imposed on your hospitality enough for one day. Eleanor shook her head emphatically and wrote, not an imposition. Ethan smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. Nevertheless, propriety suggests I shouldn't linger in a lady's parlor after her father has retired. Eleanor felt bold suddenly. She wrote quickly, Will you stay in Promise Creek? Ethan read her question and stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. I wasn't planning to, he admitted, but plans can change when the right reason presents itself. Eleanor held his gaze, hardly daring to breathe. Would you like me to stay, Eleanor? He asked softly. She nodded, the gesture small but unmistakable. Then I'll speak to your father about that teaching position, Ethan said. Though I should warn you I've been rootless for a long time, I may not be any good at staying put. Eleanor wrote one last message before he left. Sometimes the right place finds you, not the other way around. Ethan read it and touched her cheek gently. You may be right, Eleanor Zuckerman. I suppose we'll find out. The next morning, Promise Creek buzzed with gossip about the handsome stranger who might become their new schoolteacher, and his apparent interest in silent Eleanor Zuckerman. Eleanor moved through the mercantile with a lightness in her step that didn't go unnoticed by her father or their regular customers. That girl's positively glowing, Mrs. Henderson whispered loudly to her husband as Eleanor measured fabric for her. Never seen her look so alive. Eleanor pretended not to hear, but secretly hugged the observation to herself. She felt alive, more present in her own skin than she could remember being since her mother's death had stolen not just her parent, but also her voice. At midday, the bell above the door jingled and Eleanor looked up to see Sheriff Wilson enter, his weathered face grave. Jacob, he said, nodding to Eleanor's father, got some troubling news. That stranger who rode in yesterday, the one staying at the Golden Spur. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bolt of calico she was rewrapping. Ethan Robbins, her father replied. What about him? Got a wire from the sheriff over in Tucson. Says there's a man matching his description wanted for questioning about a stagecoach robbery 3 weeks back. 2 men dead. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the counter for support, unable to believe what she was hearing. That can't be right, her father protested. The man's educated, well-spoken, said he was a schoolteacher before the war. Maybe so, Sheriff Wilson shrugged. But descriptions match. Dark hair, blue eyes, scar on his chin, riding a distinctive chestnut mare. Tucson sheriff says to hold him till they can send someone to identify him. Have you arrested him? Jacob asked, glancing worriedly at Eleanor. Not yet. Came to warn you first, seeing as your daughter was seen walking out with him yesterday. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Eleanor. You should stay clear of him, Miss Zuckerman. Could be dangerous. Eleanor shook her head vehemently, reaching for her notebook. She scribbled frantically. It's a mistake. He's not a criminal. The sheriff read her note with a pitying expression. With all due respect, Miss Eleanor, you've known the man one day. You can't know what he's capable of. Eleanor felt frustration building in her chest, hot and suffocating. She wrote again, Please don't arrest him without proof. Just doing my job, miss, Sheriff Wilson replied, tipping his hat. Jacob, town council meetings at 2 to discuss this. You should be there. After the sheriff left, Eleanor's father turned to her with concern etched on his face. Eleanor, if there's even a chance this man is dangerous, Eleanor slammed her hand on the counter, the sound startling in the quiet store. She wrote rapidly, I need to warn him. Absolutely not, her father said firmly. You'll stay right here while this gets sorted out. Eleanor felt a terrible calm descend over her. For the first time in her life, she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't obey her father. Not in this. She nodded as if agreeing, then turned back to her work, mind racing. Her father watched her suspiciously for several minutes before a delivery drew his attention to the back room. The moment he was out of sight, Eleanor untied her apron, grabbed her notebook, and slipped out the front door. The Golden Spur was 3 buildings down from the Mercantile, a modest establishment that served as both hotel and saloon. Eleanor had never entered it alone before. Respectable women generally didn't, at least not through the main entrance that opened into the saloon portion. She hesitated at the door, then squared her shoulders and pushed it open. Inside, the room was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of stale beer and tobacco. A few men sat at tables despite the early hour, and all heads turned as she entered. "Well, look what the wind blew in," the bartender called out. "Miss Zuckerman, ain't it? Your pa know you're here." Eleanor ignored him, scanning the room for Ethan. Not seeing him, she approached the bar and wrote quickly, "Ethan Robbins, which room?" The bartender frowned. "Now, miss, I don't think your father would appreciate me sending you up to a man's room." Eleanor glared at him with an intensity that made him step back. She wrote again, "Sheriff coming to arrest him. Innocent, need to warn him." "Arrest?" the bartender echoed, his voice dropping. "What for?" "Stagecoach robbery," came a voice from behind Eleanor. She turned to find Beatrice Peterson standing in the doorway, a malicious smile playing on her lips. "Murder too, from what I heard, and here's silent Eleanor rushing to warn him. How scandalous." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. "Is that true, miss?" the bartender asked, suddenly wary. Eleanor shook her head emphatically, then wrote, "False accusation, please." The bartender hesitated, glancing between Eleanor and Beatrice. "Room 3 upstairs," he finally muttered. "But I didn't tell you that." Eleanor nodded gratefully and rushed toward the stairs, ignoring Beatrice's indignant call behind her. "I'm telling your father, and the sheriff." Upstairs, Eleanor found room 3 and knocked urgently. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Ethan, his expression changing from wariness to surprise when he saw her. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" She pushed past him into the room, closing the door quickly behind her. Inside, she saw his saddlebags packed and ready on the bed. He'd been preparing to leave. Eleanor wrote frantically, "Sheriff received wire from Tucson. You're wanted for questioning about robbery and murder, coming to arrest you." Ethan read her note, his face draining of color. "What, that's impossible." Eleanor studied his face, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. She found only genuine shock and growing anger. "I've never been to Tucson," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Never robbed anyone, and certainly never murdered anyone except enemy soldiers during the war." Eleanor wrote, "Sheriff said description matches. Dark hair, blue eyes, scar on chin, chestnut mare." "That could describe 100 men," Ethan protested. "Eleanor, you have to believe me, I'm not a criminal." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, an openness that she trusted instinctively. "I need to clear my name," he continued, pacing the small room. "If I run, I'll look guilty." Eleanor wrote quickly, "Sheriff Wilson seems determined. Town council meeting at 2 o'clock to discuss." "May not be fair hearing." Ethan checked his pocket watch. "That's in 20 minutes." He looked at her, decision forming in his eyes. "I'll go to the meeting, present myself before they come looking. An innocent man has nothing to hide." Eleanor shook her head violently, fear gripping her. She wrote, "Too dangerous. Let me get my father first. He'll help." "There's no time," Ethan said gently, "and you've risked enough coming here to warn me." He took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Thank you for that, Eleanor. It means more than I can say." Eleanor felt tears threatening. The idea of Ethan being arrested, possibly even hanged for a crime he didn't commit, was unbearable. Especially when she'd just found someone who truly saw her for the first time in her life. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Ethan looked stunned, then a slow smile spread across his face. "I was planning to do that properly after courting you a while," he said softly, "but I can't say I mind your way better." Eleanor blushed but didn't look away. "I'll clear my name," Ethan promised, squeezing her hands. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like to continue whatever this is between us." Eleanor nodded, her heart too full for even written words. They left the Golden Spur together, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them down the main street toward the town hall. As they approached, Eleanor could see men gathering, the town council members, including her father, who spotted them and hurried over, his face a storm of concern and anger. "Eleanor Jane Zuckerman, what do you think you're doing?" Before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Zuckerman, your daughter came to warn me of the accusations against me. I assure you they are false. I've come to clear my name." "That's for the law to decide," her father replied stiffly. "Eleanor, go home immediately." Eleanor stood her ground, shaking her head firmly. "Sir," Ethan said respectfully, "I understand your concern, but I would be grateful if Eleanor could stay. Her support means a great deal to me." Jacob Zuckerman looked between them, his expression softening slightly at what he saw in his daughter's face. "Very well. But you stay by my side, Eleanor. And Mr. Robbins, if you are innocent as you claim, you'll have my support too. I consider myself a fair judge of character." Inside the town hall, the atmosphere was tense. Sheriff Wilson stood at the front of the room, and beside him was a man Eleanor didn't recognize, a hard-faced stranger with a deputy's badge from Tucson pinned to his vest. "That's him," the Tucson deputy said as soon as Ethan entered. "That's the man who robbed the Yuma stage." "You're mistaken," Ethan replied calmly. "I've never been to Tucson, and I certainly didn't rob any stagecoach." "Then you won't mind coming back with me to face questioning," the deputy said with a smirk. "Witnesses can identify you." "What witnesses?" Jacob Zuckerman interjected. "And what proof do you have beyond a vague description that could match half the men in the territory?" "Mr. Zuckerman," Sheriff Wilson cautioned, "this is official business." "It's also a matter of justice," Ethan said firmly. "I'm being accused based on nothing but a superficial resemblance to your suspect." The Tucson deputy stepped closer, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "We also know the robber was educated, used fancy words like a schoolteacher might. And you've been asking about teaching positions here, haven't you?" Eleanor felt cold fear slide down her spine. The circumstantial evidence, weak as it was, might be enough in a frontier town where justice was often swift and crude. "This is absurd," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I can prove I wasn't anywhere near Tucson 3 weeks ago. I was in Santa Fe working for the Railroad Survey. There are documents, witnesses." "Convenient claim," the deputy sneered. "Hard to verify quickly." Eleanor suddenly reached for her notebook, an idea forming. She wrote rapidly and showed it to her father. "My daughter makes an excellent point," Jacob announced. "The telegraph office in Santa Fe could confirm Mr. Robbins's employment if we wire them." "Surely that's a simple matter before condemning a man." Sheriff Wilson frowned. "That would take time." "Less time than sending an innocent man to Tucson," Ethan pointed out. The debate continued, growing heated as various council members weighed in. Through it all, Eleanor watched the Tucson deputy, noticing something odd in his manner, a nervousness that seemed out of place for a lawman confident in his suspect. She tugged her father's sleeve and wrote another note, this time showing it discreetly to both him and Ethan. "The deputy seems too eager," Ethan read softly, "almost desperate to take me in quickly." Jacob Zuckerman's eyes narrowed as he considered this observation. "Sheriff Wilson," he called out, interrupting the arguments, "when exactly did you receive the wire from Tucson about this matter?" "This morning," Wilson replied, "just before I came to see you." "And this deputy arrived when?" The sheriff hesitated. "He rode in late last night." A murmur went through the room as everyone realized the implication. The deputy had arrived before the wire that supposedly prompted the investigation. Eleanor saw the Tucson deputy's hand twitch toward his gun as the mood in the room shifted. She grabbed Ethan's arm in warning just as the man drew his weapon. "That's enough talk," the deputy snarled. "Robbins is coming with me now. Lower your weapon," Sheriff Wilson ordered, his own hand moving to his holster. "You're all fools," the deputy spat. "This man is worth $100 reward, dead or alive." And in that moment, understanding dawned on Eleanor. This wasn't about justice, it was about bounty hunting, using a badge as cover. The deputy wasn't from Tucson at all. He was a bounty hunter hoping to collect on Ethan's wrongful arrest. Before anyone could react further, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in 8 years. She opened her mouth and forced sound past the knot of fear that had lived in her throat since her mother's death. "He's lying." She cried, her voice rough from disuse but clear enough to freeze everyone in shock. "He's not a real deputy," the bounty hunter's head snapped toward her, his momentary surprise giving Sheriff Wilson the opening he needed to draw his gun. "Drop your weapon," Wilson commanded. Instead, the false deputy fired wildly, the bullet splintering the wood paneling above Eleanor's head. Ethan shoved her to the ground, shielding her with his body as chaos erupted. More shots rang out, and when the smoke cleared, the bounty hunter lay wounded on the floor, Sheriff Wilson standing over him with a smoking gun. "Eleanor," her father cried, dropping to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, trembling from the surge of adrenaline and the shock of breaking her long silence. "You spoke," Ethan said quietly, helping her to sit up. "You spoke to save me," Eleanor nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Get his credentials," Sheriff Wilson ordered one of the council members, gesturing to the fallen bounty hunter. "Let's see who he really is." As suspected, the man carried no legitimate badge or identification from Tucson. Further questioning revealed he was indeed a bounty hunter named Silas Mercer, known for his unscrupulous methods of collecting rewards. "There is a wanted man matching your general description," Sheriff Wilson explained to Ethan as Mercer was taken to the jail. But the similarities end at dark hair and blue eyes. This snake was hoping to cash in on the confusion. "So Mr. Robbins is cleared of all suspicion?" Jacob Zuckerman asked. "He is," the sheriff confirmed. "My apologies for the trouble, Mr. Robbins." Ethan nodded his acceptance, but his attention remained fixed on Eleanor, who sat quietly, one hand at her throat as if surprised to find her voice still existed. "Are you all right?" he asked her gently. Eleanor nodded, then whispered, each word deliberate and precious, "Yes, I'm all right." Her father stared at her in astonishment. "Eleanor, you're speaking—" "I never lost my voice," she managed, the words coming slowly but clearly. "Just buried it." "Why?" her father asked, tears forming in his eyes. Eleanor swallowed hard. "After Mother died, words hurt too much. Easier to be silent." Jacob Zuckerman embraced his daughter, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I didn't understand." When he released her, Eleanor turned to Ethan, who watched her with a mixture of wonder and tenderness. "Thank you," she said carefully, "for seeing me, even in my silence." "Your silence always spoke to me," Ethan replied softly, "but I admit I do love the sound of your voice." In the days that followed, Eleanor's speech returned, gradually halting at first, then more fluid as she exercised the long-dormant skill. The town of Promise Creek buzzed with the double miracle, silent Eleanor speaking again and the dramatic exposure of the false deputy. Ethan, fully exonerated, accepted the position of schoolteacher, much to the delight of the town council. He took his duties seriously, preparing the schoolhouse for the fall term with enthusiasm that infected his new students. Eleanor continued working at the mercantile, but now she greeted customers with soft-spoken words rather than silent nods. Many were kind, expressing joy at hearing her voice at last. Others, like Beatrice Peterson, maintained a frosty distance, embarrassed by their past treatment of her. "You know," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the porch of the mercantile, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, "I never expected to find a home here." "Nor I a voice," Eleanor replied, still marveling at the feel of words on her tongue. "I think perhaps we found each other instead," Ethan said, taking her hand, "and everything else followed." Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "My silence spoke to you first." "It did," he agreed. "It was the most eloquent silence I'd ever encountered. And now—" "Now," Ethan said, turning to face her, "I love both your silence and your words. I love your courage and your stillness. I love the way you see things others miss." He paused, his blue eyes serious. "I love you, Eleanor Zuckerman, all of you." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest, expanding until she thought it might burst from her skin like sunlight. "I love you too," she whispered, the words simple but profound after so many years of holding everything inside. Ethan leaned forward, kissing her gently. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple silver band with a tiny pearl at its center. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it since leaving home, waiting for the right moment, the right person." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor Jane Zuckerman, will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this wanderer who had found his way to her, who had heard meaning in her silence when others heard nothing, who had defended her, believed in her, and ultimately helped her find her voice again. "Yes," she said, the word clear and confident. "Yes, I will." 2 months later, they were married in the Promise Creek Church, Eleanor in a cream-colored dress her father had ordered specially from St. Louis, Ethan in a new black suit that made his blue eyes even more striking. I, Eleanor Jane Zuckerman, take you, Ethan James Robbins, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she vowed, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. Not a trace remained of the girl who had been called lazy for not speaking up. At the reception that followed, even Beatrice Peterson offered congratulations, though Eleanor suspected it was more out of social obligation than genuine goodwill. You know, Jacob Zuckerman said as he danced with his daughter, I always worried what would become of you after I was gone. Who would look after my silent girl? I was never helpless, father, Eleanor replied gently, just different. I see that now, he acknowledged, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. We're both learning, she assured him. Later, as Ethan led her in a dance, he leaned close to whisper in her ear. Happy, Mrs. Robbins? Very, she confirmed, savoring the new name, though part of me almost misses being the town curiosity. Ethan laughed. I suspect you'll always be something of a curiosity, Eleanor. Not many women can claim to have exposed a false deputy and regained their voice all in one day. Not many women have a husband who valued their silence in the first place, she countered. True enough, he conceded. We're a matched pair of oddities. As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor reflected on the strange path that had led her here. All those years of silence, of being misunderstood and dismissed, had somehow prepared her for this moment, for recognizing a kindred spirit who saw beyond surfaces to the depths beneath. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Eleanor smiled. That sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. 5 years later, Eleanor sat on the porch of the small house she and Ethan had built on the outskirts of Promise Creek, watching their 3-year-old daughter, Lily, chase butterflies in the garden. Inside, Ethan was putting their infant son, Samuel, down for his afternoon nap. Promise Creek had grown in those 5 years, the railroad having finally reached them 2 years prior. New buildings lined the main street, and the population had nearly doubled. Ethan still taught at the school, while Eleanor had opened a small bookshop next to her father's mercantile, a dream she'd harbored silently for years. Mama, look, Lily called, her dark curls bouncing as she ran toward Eleanor with a flower clutched in her small hand. For you. Thank you, sweetheart, Eleanor said, accepting the slightly crushed daisy. It's beautiful. Like you, Lily declared with the absolute confidence of childhood, then darted off again in pursuit of a new treasure. Eleanor tucked the flower behind her ear just as Ethan emerged from the house, smiling at the sight. Samuel's finally asleep, he reported, sinking into the chair beside hers. That boy fights rest like it's his sworn enemy. Like his father, Eleanor teased. Always too curious about what he might miss. Ethan laughed, reaching over to take her hand. Any regrets? He asked, a question he posed occasionally, as if still amazed by the life they'd built together. Eleanor shook her head. Not one. Even though you're stuck in Promise Creek instead of seeing the world comes to us now, she reminded him, gesturing toward the railroad station visible in the distance. Besides, we have time. Lily and Samuel will grow up, and then perhaps we'll travel. I'd like that, Ethan said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, though I've found I'm surprisingly content with staying put these days. As am I, Eleanor agreed. Who would have thought it? The drifter and the silent girl settled with children and a mortgage. Life has a way of surprising us, Ethan mused. 5 years ago, I was heading to California with no intention of stopping here. And I was hiding behind my silence, letting people believe whatever they wanted about me. Ethan raised her hand to his lips. I'm glad I heard what your silence was really saying. And I'm glad I found my voice again, Eleanor said softly, though sometimes I still prefer quiet. As do I, Ethan agreed. We understand each other that way. They sat in companionable silence, watching their daughter play in the golden afternoon light. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, a reminder of the wider world beyond their small corner of it. Did I ever tell you, Ethan said after a while, that on the day I rode into Promise Creek I almost passed it by? Something made me stop, a feeling I couldn't explain. Eleanor smiled. Perhaps it was my silence calling to you. Perhaps it was, he agreed. The most eloquent silence I ever heard. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that some things needed no words at all. The years continued to flow like the creek that gave their town its name. Promise Creek grew and changed with the times, as did the family Ethan and Eleanor built together. Their children grew tall and strong, Lily with her father's quick mind and her mother's observant nature, Samuel with a wild spirit that kept them all on their toes. Eleanor's bookshop became a center of community life, hosting readings and discussions that would have been unimaginable to the silent girl she had once been. Ethan eventually became the school principal, respected throughout the county for his progressive educational ideas. And through it all, they remained each other's anchors, the drifter who had found his home and the silent woman who had found her voice, bound together by the understanding that had begun on that fateful day when he had looked at her and said, "Her silence speaks to me." On their 25th wedding anniversary, with their children grown and the first grandchild on the way, Ethan took Eleanor back to the creek where they had first truly connected. "Remember when you wrote that your dreams were sleeping?" he asked as they stood on the banks, the water flowing just as it had that day so long ago. Eleanor nodded, smiling at the memory. "I was wrong. They weren't sleeping, they were waiting. For you." Ethan pulled her close, his hair now streaked with silver but his blue eyes as bright as ever. "And mine were waiting for you, for the woman whose silence spoke volumes." "We've come a long way from that day," Eleanor observed, thinking of all they had built together. "Yes," Ethan agreed, looking back toward town where their life waited, "but the journey has been worth every step." As they walked home hand in hand, Eleanor reflected that sometimes the greatest journeys weren't measured in miles traveled, but in barriers overcome, in finding one's voice, in learning to listen, in discovering that love could speak in 1,000 ways, including silence. And in Promise Creek, where their story had begun and continued to unfold, people still sometimes talked about the strange courtship of the schoolteacher and the merchant's silent daughter. How he had defended her when others mocked, how she had spoken her first words in years to save him from false accusations, how they had built a life that transformed not just themselves but the town around them. But what Eleanor treasured most was what couldn't be seen: the quiet moments, the silent understandings, the language of love they had created together that needed no words at all. For in the end, it wasn't silence or speech that had brought them together, but recognition of seeing and being seen, of hearing what others missed, of finding in each other the perfect complement to their own souls. And as the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor squeezed Ethan's hand, communicating in that simple gesture all that needed to be said between them. Some things, after all, would always transcend words.